The Last Watch of the North. A Tale of the Fading Lands. By the fireside of memory, when the world was wider and the stars shone with a clearer light, there lived in the uttermost northern reaches of the known lands a company of watchers. They were not many, never many, for their order had dwindled with the turning of ages, and the great deeds of elder days had passed into legend, and from legend into song, and from song into silence. Yet they kept their vigil still. The people of the southern kingdoms, those who dwelt in walled cities and cultivated fields, knew little of these watchers. To the merchants who traveled the great roads, they were merely rumors whispered in wayside inns, tales of grim rangers who walked the wild places, keeping at bay things that had no names in the tongues of ordinary folk. The common people called them the Grey Company, or sometimes the Northern Guard, and mothers would hush their children with stories of how these silent protectors stood between the peaceful lands and the darkness beyond. But the Watchers called themselves simply the Remnant. In the autumn of the third epoch, for so the learned chroniclers numbered the years, there remained only 7 of their order at the ancient stone keep they called Greywarden. It stood on a hill at the edge of the great forest, where the land began its long climb toward the frozen wastes. The keep was old beyond the memory of living men, built of gray stone that seemed almost part of the hill itself, and its walls had been raised in days when other powers held sway over Middle-earth. The captain of this small company was named Aldrich. He was not young, though neither was he yet old. Somewhere in that long middle stretch of life where a man's strength remains, but his hair begins to gray and his eyes hold the weight of years. He had been born in a village far to the south, where apple trees grew in ordered rows and children played in streets of cobblestone. But that life had been left behind long ago, and now he could barely remember the face of the girl he had once thought to marry, or the sound of church bells on a summer morning. What he remembered instead were the lessons of his predecessor, old Captain Edric, who had trained him in the arts of tracking and woodcraft, of reading weather, and recognizing the signs of corruption in the wild places. Edric had fallen in the line of duty 15 years past, brought down by a poisoned arrow while scouting the edge of the blighted lands. With his dying breath, he had pressed the captain's badge, a simple circlet of silver worked with stars, into Aldrich's palm, and whispered, "The watch must not end." And so Aldrich had taken up the burden. The other 6 watchers under his command were as different as could be imagined. Yet Brennan, a tall man from the eastern marches, who could track a spider across bare rock, and whose eyes could pierce the deepest shadow. Beside him often stood Corin, shorter and stockier, whose people had been farmers for generations, until the blight crept close to their lands, and he chose the sword over the plow. The twins, Elwyn and Aaron, had come from a line of foresters. Taciturn and swift, they spoke more to each other in glances than most people managed with words. Their movements in the woodland were like water flowing over stone, so natural and unhurried that game birds would sometimes fail to startle at their approach. Then there was old Marcus, who was not truly old in years, but felt ancient in spirit, for he had seen things in the dark places that carved lines deeper than time into his weathered face. He seldom smiled, but when he did, it was like the sun breaking through winter clouds. And finally, there was Linnea, the only woman among them who had arrived at Greywarden 5 years ago with a bow across her back and a determination in her eyes that reminded Aldrich of steel being forged. She never spoke of her past, and the others had learned not to ask. But she could put an arrow through a falling leaf at 50 paces, and her courage had been proven in a dozen skirmishes against the things that crept down from the north. These 7 kept the watch. Their days followed patterns laid down through generations. Each dawn, scouts would set out in pairs to walk the boundary paths, ancient trails that formed a great circle around the lands they protected. They looked for signs, tracks in the soft earth, broken branches that suggested something large had passed, the peculiar silence that falls over a forest when predators of an unnatural kind draw near. In the afternoon, they would maintain their weapons and equipment, tend to their horses, and see to the countless small tasks that keep a garrison functioning. The keep itself required constant attention. Mortar that needed replacing, shutters that had warped in the weather, stores that needed checking against the inventory books. But it was the evenings that Aldrich treasured most. When the day's work was done and a fire crackled in the great hearth of the hall, the 7 would gather and share the news of their patrols. They would eat simple fare, bread and cheese, stew made from whatever game they had taken, apples from the ancient orchard that somehow still bore fruit, despite the creeping cold of recent years. And sometimes, when the fire burned low and the shadows grew long, they would tell the old stories. Marcus knew the most tales, for he had served under 3 captains and learned them all by heart. He spoke of the great battles of the elder days, when the powers of the world were younger, and armies of light clashed with armies of darkness on fields that no longer existed, swallowed by time and change. He told of heroes whose names were now only remembered in song, the wandering king who had reclaimed his throne, the wizard who had fallen and risen again, the fellowship that had carried hope into the very heart of shadow. But we are not in those times, Marcus would always conclude, staring into the flames. The great powers have passed. The elder folk have sailed away. The wizards have withdrawn. What remains is less, smaller, But the darkness remains too, in its own diminished way. And so we remain, to stand against it. It was a melancholy thought, but there was also pride in it. They were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back beyond memory. They were, in their own small way, part of something greater than themselves. The autumn deepened, and the days grew short. It was on a gray morning, with frost rimming the grass and the breath of men and horses steaming in the cold air, that Brennan and Corin returned from their patrol with troubling news. They had found signs in the northern quarter, a deer carcass that had been wrong, not eaten by wolves or bears, but drained and twisted, its eyes frozen wide in terror, and its bones showing evidence of corruption. Aldrich examined their sketches and listened to their report with growing concern. "How far from the boundary?" he asked. 3 miles within," Brennan replied, his weathered face grave. "Whatever killed it came from beyond the edge."
And the tracks?
"None that we could read clearly. The ground was hard with frost." "But—" Brennan hesitated. "Speak plainly," Aldrich said. "We felt watched, Captain, both of us, the whole way back." Corin nodded agreement, his hand resting unconsciously on the pommel of his sword. "Something is paying attention to us." That evening, Aldrich called a council. They gathered in the map room, a circular chamber in the highest tower where charts and documents from centuries of watching covered the walls. A great map dominated the center table, showing the keep, the surrounding forest, and the gradual transition from green woodland to the gray marks that indicated the blighted lands beyond. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Aldrich said, placing a marker on the map where the corrupted deer had been found. "Brennan and Corin will scout again tomorrow, but ranging farther north. Elwyn and Aaron, I want you to check the eastern approaches. See if there's any sign of movement around the old ruins there. Marcus, Linnea, you'll hold the keep." "And you?" Linnea asked. "I'll ride to the village," Aldrich said. "The folk there should be warned to keep closer to home, especially after dark. And I want to consult the records, see if there's anything in the archives about similar signs." The village of Thornhaven lay a half-day's ride to the south, nestled in a valley where the land was still good and crops still grew. It was home to perhaps 200 souls, farmers mostly, with a smithy, a mill, a modest inn, and a small stone church where an elderly priest kept the old rites. The people there lived simple lives, and they looked to Grey Warden for protection they only half believed they needed. Aldrich arrived at midday, and went first to the house of the headman, a stout farmer named Gareth, whose grandfather had held the same position. Gareth welcomed him with the wary respect that common folk often showed the watchers, gratitude mixed with unease, for the Grey Company was a reminder that the world held darker things than drought or wolves. "Captain," Gareth said, pouring ale from a clay jug, "it's rare we see you down from the keep. Is there trouble?" "Perhaps," Aldrich replied. "We've found signs that something unnatural is moving in the northern forest. I'd advise your people to stay close to the village after dark, and to make sure their doors are barred and their windows shuttered." Gareth's ruddy face paled slightly. "What sort of signs?" Aldrich described what they had found, though he softened the details. No need to terrify honest farmers with talk of corruption and twisted things. "It may be nothing," he added, which was not quite a lie. "But caution is wisdom." After speaking with Gareth, Aldrich visited the church. Father Baron was ancient, his back bent with years and his hands gnarled as old roots, but his mind remained sharp as ever. The church was dim and cool, smelling of candle wax and old stone. Icons of saints and heroes decorated the walls, figures from the old stories, their names now as much legend as history. "My son," Father Baron greeted him, "you have the look of one who bears heavy news." They sat together in the front pew, and Aldrich explained the situation. The old priest listened without interrupting, his fingers working the worn beads of a prayer cord. "The boundary grows thin," Baron said at last. "In my grandfather's time, such things were common. The watchers were always finding signs and turning back incursions. Then came a long peace, and people began to forget. They thought the darkness had been defeated forever." He shook his head. "But darkness is patient. It retreats, but it does not truly die. It waits." "Is there anything in the old records?" Aldrich asked. "The church keeps archives going back centuries." "Come," Baron said, rising slowly. He led Aldrich through a narrow door behind the altar and down stone steps into a cellar that had been converted into a library. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books and scrolls and loose documents tied with ribbon. They searched together, the old priest remarkably spry when it came to navigating his collection. At last, he pulled down a leather-bound volume and opened it carefully on a reading desk. "Here," he said, pointing to a page covered in faded ink. "From the chronicles of the Second Epoch. There was a time, about 300 years past, when similar signs appeared. Creatures coming down from the north, twisted things that preyed on livestock at first, then grew bolder." Aldrich read the passage, his heart sinking. The chronicle described a year of increasing terror, of villages abandoned, of watchers falling in lonely battles. It had taken the arrival of reinforcements from the southern kingdoms, soldiers and knights in numbers the Grey Company could no longer muster, to push the darkness back. "How many watchers were there then?" he asked. Baron traced a finger down the page. The chronicle mentions 40 men holding Grey Warden, with outposts at 3 other locations. He looked up at Aldrich. "I know you are fewer now." 7, Aldrich said quietly. The old priest laid a hand on his shoulder. "Then you must be 7 times as vigilant. But know this, you are not alone. The people here remember what you do for them, even if they don't speak of it. And there are powers in the world yet, though they are distant and their attention is elsewhere. Do not lose hope." Aldrich rode back to Grey Warden as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The forest seemed to press closer as the light failed, and he found himself gripping his sword hilt more tightly than usual. Twice he thought he heard movement in the trees parallel to the road, but when he stopped to listen, there was only silence. He was glad when the gray walls of the keep came into view and the gate opened to admit him. "We need more information," Aldrich said. "Tomorrow, Brennan and Corin will make their scout as planned. But I want everyone on heightened alert. No one goes out alone, and everyone carries signal horns. If you run into something you can't handle, blow 3 times and withdraw. We'll come to you." Over the following days, a pattern emerged. The signs multiplied. More dead animals found in the northern quarter, all showing the same marks of corruption. Tracks appeared that matched nothing in their experience. Too large for wolves, too many claws, moving sometimes on 4 legs and sometimes on 2. And always the watchers felt themselves observed. It came to a head on a night when the moon was new and darkness lay heavy on the land. Aldrich was standing the midnight watch on the keep's wall when he heard the sound that every watcher dreaded. 3 horn blasts from the north, thin and desperate in the cold air. He was running before the echoes faded, shouting for the others. Within moments they were mounted and thundering out through the gate, following the north road by lantern light. The horses sensed their riders' urgency and needed little encouragement. They found Elwyn and Aaron a mile from the keep, backed against a standing stone with their swords drawn and blood on their faces. Around them in a rough circle prowled 3 shapes that seemed to drink the lantern light. Things that might have once been wolves but were no longer, twisted by some dark art into something worse. Their eyes glowed with a sickly green luminescence, and their movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural. "Form up," Aldrich commanded, and the watchers moved with the precision of long practice. Linnea's bow sang, and one of the creatures went down with an arrow through its throat. Brennan and Corin charged from the left, while Marcus and Aldrich came from the right, and the things that had been wolves found themselves surrounded instead of surrounding. The fight was brief but brutal. The corrupted beasts were strong and fast, but they were mindless, driven only by hunger and malice. The watchers had skill and purpose. When it was done, all three creatures lay dead, and the company stood breathing hard in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" Aldrich asked the twins. "Scratches only," Aaron replied, while Elwyn simply nodded. They were pale, but steady. "We were checking the stone circle," Elwyn said. "These things came out of nowhere. They were waiting for us." Aldrich looked down at the nearest corpse. In death, it looked almost like a normal wolf, but the smell of corruption was unmistakable, and its claws were too long, its teeth too many. "This was a test," Marcus said quietly. "Something sent these to probe our defenses, to see how we would respond." "Then whatever sent them knows we're here," Linnea added. Aldrich nodded slowly. "Back to the keep. We'll burn these carcasses in the morning. I don't want their corruption seeping into the earth. Tonight, double watch. And tomorrow, we need to make a decision." They rode back through the darkness, and Aldrich felt the weight of command settling more heavily on his shoulders. This was more than a few corrupted animals straying over the boundary. Something was actively pushing against their defenses, testing their strength. And they were only 7. The next morning, after the twisted carcasses had been burned on a pyre and the smoke had carried their taint away on the wind, Aldrich called another council. "We're facing a decision," he said, looking around the table at his companions. "We can hold the keep and maintain our patrols, hoping this is just a temporary incursion. Or we can take the fight forward, scout deeper into the blighted lands, and try to find the source of this corruption." "How deep?" Brennan asked. "The old records mention a place," Aldrich said, pulling out the map. "About 20 miles north of our usual boundary, there's a ruin. In the Second Epoch, it was a fortress of some kind, but it fell and was abandoned. According to Father Barron's chronicles, that's where the corrupted things were coming from back then. If something is organizing these attacks, that's likely where we'll find it." 20 miles into hostile territory," Corin said slowly. "With 7 of us." 6, Marcus corrected. "Someone needs to stay and hold the keep, maintain the defenses here. If we all go and something happens, Grey Warden could fall without anyone to sound the alarm." "I'll stay," Linnea said immediately. But Aldrich shook his head. "We need your bow. No, it should be—" "I'll stay," Marcus interrupted. "I'm the oldest. My tracking skills aren't what they were, and in a running fight I'd slow you down. But I can hold walls and work a crossbow as well as ever. Leave me supplies and go do what needs to be done." There was a moment of silence. Then Aldrich nodded. "Very well. We'll leave at first light tomorrow. Travel light and fast, with enough provisions for 5 days. If we're not back in 7, assume the worst." "And then what?" Marcus asked. Then you ride to Thornhaven, gather as many able fighters as you can, and fall back to the village. Hold there and send word to the southern kingdoms that the watch has failed and they need to send aid." It was a grim contingency, but necessary. They spent the rest of the day in preparation, checking weapons, packing supplies, feeding and grooming the horses. There was little conversation. Each of them knew that they might be riding toward their deaths, but that was the nature of their calling. The watch did not guarantee safety. It promised only that they would stand between the darkness and the innocent for as long as they could. That evening, they gathered one last time in the hall. The fire burned bright, and Marcus told a story. Not one of the grand tales of heroes and battles, but a simple story about a farmer who had found an orphaned fox cub and raised it. It was a story about small kindnesses in a hard world, and when it was done, they sat in comfortable silence. "Whatever happens," Aldrich said at last, "it's been an honor to serve with all of you." "The honor is ours, Captain," Brennan replied, and the others murmured agreement. They rode out at dawn, 6 mounted figures passing through the gate of Greywarden while Marcus stood on the wall and watched them go. The morning was cold and clear, with frost sparkling on the grass and the sun just beginning to touch the tops of the trees. For the first few miles, they followed familiar paths, but then they crossed the boundary and entered lands where the watchers rarely ventured. The forest here was different. The trees were darker, their branches twisted, and the undergrowth grew thick and tangled. There were no bird songs, no signs of normal life. The silence was oppressive. They moved cautiously, with Elwyn and Aaron ranging ahead as scouts, and Brennan watching their back trail. The horses sensed the wrongness of this place and required constant reassurance. By midday, they had covered perhaps 8 miles. They stopped to rest and water the horses at a stream, though they boiled the water before drinking. One could not trust anything in the blighted lands to be pure. While they rested, Corin climbed a tall oak to get a better view of the terrain ahead. "I can see something," he called down. "Maybe 5 miles north. Looks like ruins, stone walls, mostly fallen." "That matches the location on the map," Aldrich said. "We'll push on for another 2 hours, then make camp while there's still light. I want to approach the ruins at dawn when we can see clearly." The afternoon wore on. The forest seemed to press closer, and twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through particularly dense thickets. Once they found the remains of what might have been a road, ancient paving stones just visible beneath centuries of leaf mold, and followed it for a while before it disappeared again into the undergrowth. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they found a defensible spot, a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a rocky outcrop at one end that would serve as a backstop. They made a cold camp, not daring to light a fire that might draw attention, and set a watch rotation. The night passed slowly. Every sound seemed magnified. The rustle of leaves, the crack of a distant branch, the call of some night bird that might not have been a bird at all. But nothing attacked, and when the gray light of dawn finally came, they rose stiff and cold, but unharmed. They left the horses hobbled in the clearing with enough fodder for the day, taking only what weapons and equipment they could carry. If they had to retreat in a hurry, the horses would slow them down in dense forest, and there was no point in risking the animals unnecessarily. Moving on foot, they were even more cautious. Elwyn and Erin led the way, reading the ground and finding the safest paths. The ruins appeared gradually through the trees, first just hints of worked stone, then a collapsed wall, then finally the full extent of the place revealed itself. It had been a fortress once, that much was clear. Great blocks of gray stone lay tumbled and overgrown with moss and vine, but the basic structure was still visible. An outer wall with towers at the corners, an inner keep, what might have been a great hall. But it had fallen long ago, and time and weather had worked their decay. Yet it was not completely abandoned. As they crouched in the tree line, studying the ruins, they saw movement. Things shambled through the broken walls. More of the corrupted beasts they had fought before, but also larger shapes, harder to distinguish in the shadows. And from somewhere deep within the ruins came a sound that made their skin crawl, a low, rhythmic chanting in no language any of them recognized. "There's someone, or something, in there conducting some kind of ritual," Linnea whispered. Aldrich nodded grimly. "We need to stop it. Whatever's happening here, it's the source of the corruption spreading south. If we can end it, we might buy years of peace." "And if we can't?" Corin asked. "Then Marcus sounds the alarm, and hopefully the southern kingdoms respond before it's too late." Aldrich looked at each of them in turn. "This is what we trained for. This is why the Watch exists. Are you with me?" One by one, they nodded. "Then let's end this." They split into two groups. Elwyn, Erin, and Brennan would circle to the east and find a way in through what looked like a collapsed section of wall. Aldrich, Corin, and Linnea would approach from the west, drawing attention and creating a diversion. They synchronized their movements, counted to 100, and then moved. The approach was agonizingly slow, using every scrap of cover, freezing whenever one of the corrupted beasts looked their way. But they made it to the base of the western wall without being detected. Aldrich could see inside now, through a gap where stones had fallen. The interior courtyard was a scene from a nightmare. A great fire burned in the center, but its flames were the wrong color, sickly green and giving off oily black smoke. Around it, figures moved and chanted. They might have been human once, but corruption had warped them into something else. And at the center of it all, directing the ritual, stood a being wrapped in tattered robes, its face hidden in shadow beneath a hood. "A sorcerer," Linnea breathed. "A dark practitioner. I thought they were all gone." "Evidently not," Aldrich replied. He looked at Corin. "When I give the signal, you and I go over the wall and make as much noise as possible. Linnea, stay here and shoot anything that comes at us. Aim for the sorcerer if you get a clear shot. And the others? Trust them to do their part." Aldrich took a deep breath, offered a quick prayer to whatever powers might be listening, and then shouted, "Now!" He and Corin scrambled over the rubble and into the courtyard, weapons drawn and voices raised in a battle cry meant to startle and confuse. The effect was immediate. The chanting stopped. The corrupted things wheeled toward them with snarls and screams. And the sorcerer raised one arm, pointing directly at the two watchers. Lightning crackled from its fingertips, but Aldrich had been expecting something like that. He dove left while Corin rolled right, and the bolt scorched the stones between them. Then they were up and running, not toward the sorcerer, but toward the nearest group of corrupted beasts, drawing them away from the ritual circle. Behind them, Linnea's bow sang. An arrow took one of the beasts in the eye, and it went down thrashing. Another arrow, another kill. She was a machine of precision and death, her face utterly calm. And then, from the eastern side of the courtyard, came the twins and Brennan. They had scaled the wall unseen, and now dropped into the courtyard behind the sorcerer. Before it could react, Brennan's sword took it across the back of the legs, bringing it down. But it did not fall easily. Even wounded, the sorcerer had power. It gestured, and flames erupted around Brennan, driving him back. It spoke words that hurt to hear, and the very stones of the courtyard seemed to writhe and reach for the twins. They danced back, blades flashing, cutting at shadowy tendrils that reached for them. Aldrich fought his way through two of the corrupted beasts, Corin at his back, trying to reach the sorcerer. This was the key. If they could bring it down, the ritual would fail, and its minions would lose direction. An arrow from Linnea took the sorcerer in the shoulder, spoiling whatever spell it had been casting. It staggered, and in that moment Elwyn was there, her sword finding a gap in its robes and biting deep into flesh that was no longer quite human. The sorcerer screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and fell. The green fire guttered and went out. The corrupted beasts faltered, their coordination lost. Some fled into the ruins. Others turned on each other in confusion. The watchers cut down those that remained hostile, and within minutes The courtyard was silent except for the heavy breathing of the living and the moans of the dying. Aldrich approached the fallen sorcerer cautiously. It lay broken on the stones, its hood fallen back to reveal a face that had once been human but was now twisted by the very darkness it had served. Its eyes, as life faded from them, were not triumphant or angry, but sad. "Why?" Aldrich asked, though he expected no answer. But the sorcerer smiled, showing black teeth. "The watch ends," it whispered. "You are too few. More will come, always more." Then it died, and whatever dark power had animated it departed, leaving only a corpse that rapidly began to decay into dust and ash. "Is it done?" Corin asked, blood running from a cut on his arm. Aldrich looked around the courtyard. The ritual circle was broken, the green fire was out, the corrupted things were scattered or slain. "For now," he said, "but we need to make sure. Search the ruins. Find any artifacts or texts the sorcerer was using. We'll burn them or bring them back to be properly dealt with." They spent the next hour combing through the ruins. They found a makeshift study in what had once been a cellar, a space filled with dark books, reagents in jars, and instruments whose purposes they could only guess at. Brennan, who had some education in the old scripts, examined the books and declared them too dangerous to keep. "This is dark lore from the ancient days," he said, his face grim. "Better it be destroyed." They built a pyre in the courtyard and burned everything, feeding the fire with wood from the dead trees that grew within the ruins. As the flames consumed the dark sorcerer's works, Aldrich felt a subtle change in the air, as if a weight had been lifted, as if the land itself could breathe more easily. "Come," he said at last, when the fire had burned down to embers. "Let's go home." The journey back to Grey Warden took 2 days. They moved faster, no longer needing stealth, and the forest itself seemed lighter, less oppressive. They reached their horses safely, and then pushed on, camping one more night before the familiar walls of the keep came into view. Marcus was waiting at the gate, crossbow in hand, but when he saw them, his weathered face split into a broad smile. "I knew you'd make it," he said, though his eyes were moist. That night they gathered in the hall and told him everything. Marcus listened, asked questions, and finally nodded in satisfaction. "You've done what 3 companies of watchers couldn't manage in the Second Epoch," he said. "You've bought us time, maybe years, maybe decades. But it's not ended forever," Aldrich said, remembering the sorcerer's last words. "More will come. The darkness is patient." "Then we'll be here," Linnea said simply. and the others nodded agreement. In the days that followed, they resumed their patrols. The signs of corruption faded. The forest began to recover. When Aldrich rode to Thornhaven to report the outcome to the headman and Father Baron, he found the villagers already speaking of the change, how the air felt cleaner, how the livestock were calmer, how children no longer had nightmares. "The watch continues," Father Baron said, when Aldrich had finished his report. The old priest laid a hand on the watcher's shoulder. "And as long as it does, there is hope." Aldrich rode back to Greywarden with those words echoing in his mind. The watch continues. It was both burden and blessing, both duty and honor. They were only 7, now 6, with Marcus growing older every year and no new recruits coming from the south. But they were enough. For now, they were enough. Winter came, and the keep stood firm against wind and snow. The watchers kept their vigil, walking the boundary paths even in the deepest cold. They repaired their equipment, trained together in the courtyard when the weather allowed, and in the long evenings they told the old stories around the fire. Spring followed winter, as it always had and always would. The apple trees in the orchard bloomed against all odds, and Aldrich took it as a sign. Life persisting, hope enduring. One evening, as the sun set red and gold over the forest, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Aldrich stood on the keep's highest tower and looked north. The wild lands stretched away into the distance, beautiful and terrible and endless. Somewhere out there, he knew, the darkness was waiting. It would gather strength again in time. It would test them again. That was the nature of things. But for tonight, for this moment, the watch was kept. The lands were safe. The people slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of the price that was paid for their peace. And that was enough. Aldrich smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face, and turned to go back down to his companions. There was soup for dinner, and Corin had promised to tell the story of the time he'd mistaken a merchant's prize pig for a corrupted beast and nearly caused a diplomatic incident. It would be good to laugh. They had earned it. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient courses, and Greywarden stood, gray and solid and enduring. The last watch of the North continued, as it had for generations, as it would for generations to come. Because the watch must not end. Not while even one watcher remained to keep it. Not while there was still hope. Not while there were still stories to be told around fires on cold nights, and children to be protected, and dawn to look forward to, and the simple knowledge that good people stood between the darkness and the light. The watch continued, and that was everything.